So yes, a challenging question which I have been given to the organizers, the nice organizer of this meeting, and I'm trying to discuss this question with you today. So I will start by describing the properties of this number sense, or at least what I mean for number sense, and then define and describe the evidence that number sense is expandable, and then trying to think with you what are the mechanisms that could account for this expansion. So let me go very quickly through all this because you all know about that, but I just need to set the basic of what I'm talking about. So number sense is a system that extracts the cardinality. We've been listening about this system all day. It allows to extract the cardinality of concrete sets and also to mental combine cardinality through operation of comparison, addition, and subtraction. This system is evolutionary ancient, of course pre-verbal, and present very, very early in life. Thanks to this mechanism, young babies can, for example, match numerosities across sensory stimulus, such that, for example, after having been familiarized by given sequences of sound, they look longer to an image that contained the same number of items as the number of sound that they heard, here from the work of Véronique Izard. What are the computational signatures of this system? We have described at least two computational signatures. First of all, this system doesn't seem to have capacity limits. It applies to small and large sets of items equally. But it is imprecise. Number is mentally represented in a non-precise way, and the precision of the representation decreases with its cardinality, such that the perception of difference across sets is proportional of their numerical ratio. A way to describe this is that the internal representation is a logarithmic function of the external cardinality. And indeed, if we set an experimental paradigm correctly, we can extract and define the precision of the numerical representation for each individual, such that each individual can be characterized by a single value, the Weber fraction, that is an index of how well mental representation of cardinality of set is for each and every individual. We have also described that this system, even though it is internally inconsistent for every person, actually changes across life. It has a developmental trajectory which has been described. Number sense acuity, indexed by this Weber fraction value, decreases with age. We become better and better at discriminating between quantities of different sets. Babies are only sensitive to numerical ratio 1 to 3, and we have heard about that. And then when we get through adulthood, we are sensitive to very, very small numerical differences across sets, ratios of about 8 to 9 or 7 to 8. We have also described the neural basis of this very basic system. Across different species, we seem to have found homologous regions that are located in the human adult brain, in the baby brain, as well as in the macaque brain, you have heard, regions around the interparietal sulcus that extract the numerosity of concrete sets. And on the basis of this evidence, we have described a very simple scenario that could underline acquisition of symbols for number and symbolic calculation in children. So the idea is that when children learn counting and symbolic calculation, symbols for numbers, their parietal number sense system is already in place. What they have to do is to create, of course, new auditory and visual representation for numerical symbols, and to connect this new representation to the pre-existing codes for numerical quantities. All right, so according to this idea, this number sense system is foundational for later acquisition of symbols for number and symbolic calculation. What is the evidence that we have that prove that this statement is actually corresponding to something that is really happening? First of all, neural evidence. The same regions in parietal cortex which are implicated in number sense tasks, in tasks in which subject has to compare sets of objects, are also active during symbolic mental calculation in both adult and children of all culture. Here is data from adults, and here from young children in a recent paper from Jessica Cantland, for example. And the same region in parietal cortex respond according to a quantity code for both concrete sets and for numerical symbols. We also have a lot of behavioral evidence since a long time now that tells us that adults and children cannot help but treat to some level of information processing symbols for number that by definition are digital representation of exact quantity as analog magnitude. So for example, when we ask adults and children to compare this digit and we measure the reaction time and accuracy, we see that the time they take to respond and the number of errors they make is a direct function or at least modulated significantly by the numerical ratio across these symbols. Again, we demonstrated also that number sense is perturbed in developmental dyscalculia. Again, can be taken as an evidence that an immature number sense doesn't allow children to develop appropriate symbolic numerical abilities. So with this very simple psychophysical task, using the method of constant stimuli, we measure for each and any participant the Weber fraction for this dot comparison task. And we tested the children of different age and adults as well as a group of dyscalculic. And we showed that the Weber fraction in dyscalculic is much higher than their control matched for age and intelligence, and indeed not significantly different from a group of kindergarteners tested here. Even when we look at single cases, we can see a very tight link between the ability of performing symbolic calculation and this very basic sense of numerical quantities. We are very lucky in the lab recently to be able to test a young boy. We could test him twice, once when he was 4 and the other when he was 6, which was a really exceptional calculator. Very briefly, I can tell you that already at 4 years old, he could transcode up to 6-digit number. He could type very quickly the numbers that we would tell him, very big numbers, and he could perform mental calculation of up to 5-digit numbers mentally without making any error and no effort. We also test this little boy, Ludovic, with this basic task, using exactly the same stimuli and experimental paradigm that we have used with all our different participants in previous studies. And you can see that the Weber fraction from this boy is is very small, and indeed smaller than the average of children that we tested that had his age, and non-significantly different from a group of adults that participated in this experiment. For those that are interested, here are the psychometric function of this guy, and it shows that his behavior is really very precise. On the other side of the coin, we also had the chance to test recently an old lady, well old, 48 years old, high school professor, very educated person. She was, of course, professor of French literature, not mathematics professor, who was profoundly dyscalculic. She couldn't solve multiplication, single-digit multiplication problems. She made, out of 12 problems, she made 10 errors, and she could take up to 12 seconds to solve a single-digit addition, making a lot of effort using fingers and all sorts of verbal strategies. When we showed her these stimuli, she was very confused and very angry at us. She said, I can't see the difference. Of course, her visual acuity is perfect. So it is not a problem of vision. It was a problem of discriminating between quantities. And in fact, as you can see from her behavior, very noisy, the Weber fraction in this task was very low. Indeed, this is Madame S. She's not significantly different from the group of preschooling children. Okay, so maybe this is a bit anecdotal, but it shows that even single cases that are very extreme in the continuum of the acquisition of arithmetical competencies can be very well traced on their basic sense of number. Other evidence is that there are the number sense is a longitudinal predictor of subsequent arithmetical abilities. Children tested with this basic numerical non-symbolic comparison task at preschool show that the better they are in comparing these quantities, the better they will be 1 year later in test of arithmetical competence and symbolic numerical competences. However, we have also shown that not only this number sense is basically foundational for subsequent acquisition, but as a function of the acquisition of symbols for number, counting, and calculation, this very basic perceptual ability is profoundly changed. And we tested this hypothesis by looking at the Munduruku population, which you have already been introduced with. This population doesn't have in their indigenous culture a system for exact counting. And as a matter of fact, they don't have symbols for exact numbers beyond 3 or 4. So their sense of number remains very approximate. However, some of them start to receive some education, and so they start being able to attend some years of formal schooling. So we could compare a group of uneducated Munduruku and the group of Munduruku that got some education. And you can see that this is developmental trajectory of Italian participant, and you can see that Munduruku participant never managed to get a Weber fraction below the preschooling children. And this is evidence that education at some level influences the ability of performing this basic perceptual numerical task. Indeed, the Weber fraction, the variability across subject, here every red point is a subject, could be well explained by the number of years of education that this Munduruku subject could attend. And indeed, there seems to be a drop at about the 3rd year, which is exactly when in the Munduruku system, counting and symbolic arithmetic is introduced. We also had a control task to exclude any effect of generic attention or generic visual acuity or, in fact, generic magnitude acuity effects from mathematical education. And so we presented another group of Munduruku with a task that has the very same psychophysical properties as the numerical comparison, which is they had to choose the larger of 2 extent. So it's a size comparison task. And of course, some subjects were completely uneducated and some received some education. Do mathematical education affect this task as it affects the numerical task? The answer is no. First of all, you can see that Munduruku subjects were very good in performing this task, and that we could detect an effect of age. So there is some maturation in performing this task as well. So the Weber fraction for size decreases as people grow up. However, there was no significant, actually not at all, an effect of education. There is other effects of numeracy on number sense. Not only number sense becomes sharper, but there seems to be a shift from a compressed to a linear scale. Indeed, again, studying Munduruku, our colleagues managed to show that in a very simple task in which there is a number line which is oriented from 1 to, for example, 10 in this example, concrete objects are presented, and participants are asked to position different quantities using a cursor along this line. You can see that the mapping from the Munduruku participant, which don't know how to count and how to use symbols for numbers, is logarithmic, while in American participant this is linear. And it is the same sort of logarithmic and linear in Munduruku and American participant when they use tones. And a similar trend from a log or a compressed mapping and a linear mapping can be shown even when they use symbols for numbers. Finally, in fact, if we think about pedagogical tools, it is clear that pedagogical supports that make explicit reference to linearly scaled number lines have been shown to be particularly effective. For example, Griffin and Kay show educative problems with number line activity increase durably calculation skill in low socioeconomic status children. Ramani and Ziegler, we know probably about this. Short training with the games, board game that represent the numbers as linearly spaced on a line, also increase performance in number task in low socioeconomic status children. And generally speaking, Montessori training problem, which simultaneously associate numerical quantities with symbols and numerical lines, seem to improve math achievement compared to other pedagogical tools. So it is clear that not only number sense funds, it's foundational for numeracy acquisition, but that there is an influence from numerical acquisition onto number sense. It becomes more precise and the linear scale becomes linear. Now the real question that we have to face now is what are the mechanisms that underlie these changes? And one way to ask this question is to ask what are the cognitive components that are crucially involved when children learn counting and symbols for number and symbolic arithmetic. It seems to be the case that there are at least 3 systems that are interrelated in this initial learning process. First of all, well, we have the sensor-numerical quantity component, which we have shown has been necessary, but surely not sufficient. Second, there might be a linguistic component. Children need to have a phonological system intact to recite the number line, some sense of syntax, at least for understanding n-digit numbers, and some sense of recursion as well. And finally, a third system, which I'm going to focus now because of the focus of the day, is the impact of visuospatial and visuomotor component. As a matter of fact, children, when learn the meaning of exact number, they use counting, and therefore, in order to do so, they use individual object tracking ability. They use pointing, eye movement, finger counting, and maybe also some mental imagery component where they simulate the concrete numerical transformation of sets to find out the result of a symbolic addition or subtraction operation. Indeed, quite a lot of research in the dyscalculia literature show that not only dyscalculic have impaired number sense, but also very often they show low visuospatial skills. Now, I want to attack the problem on taking it from the other side. And in collaboration with Caroline Huon, who is a specialist of dyspraxia in our lab, and Alice Gomez, who's doing a postdoc on this topic, we asked the question of what is the role of fine motor control and visuospatial ability on the acquisition of calculation and symbolic numerical abilities. So we studied developmental coordination disorder, which is otherwise called sometimes dyspraxia, because these are children that with otherwise completely impaired cognitive skills and normal intelligence have deeply impaired ability to perform fine motor coordination tasks and visual motor coordination tasks. These are children that are described as clumsy, that have very big problems at school because they are dysgraphic. Sometimes also they develop reading disorders. And there is no study that investigates thoroughly numerical competencies in these children. So if visuospatial abilities and visuomotor coordination abilities are essential to learn calculation, then we should report impairment in this population. So first of all, we show that we compare a group of dyspraxic children with a group of control matched for age and verbal IQ. You can see the IQ measure. There is no difference in our group. Then we also show, and this is already very well known, that dyspraxic children, even though we define them as visuomotor coordination impaired children, they also have visuospatial problems, even in tasks where no motor coordination ability is required. So, for example, in the block design and in the arrow task of the NEPSI and neuropsychological scale, these are tasks that tap with visuospatial abilities without asking them to manipulate fine objects with their hands. They are deeply impaired. So we have a population where motor coordination and visuospatial abilities are impaired. How do they perform with numerical tasks? First of all, we want to investigate their mental representation of number, even without any calculation abilities involved. And we use a task which is the line to number task. So it's the reverse of the task you have been described earlier. We presented them with lines that were oriented from 0 to 100, and from trial to trial, hash mark that could be presented at a different position of the line. And we asked them to estimate which number they thought would fall exactly on the position of the hash mark. And with this graph, you can show the hash mark position as a function of the mean response. Of course, if the mental representation of number for dyspraxic children was immature and maybe logarithmic, then the response should fall on this exponential curve. In fact, you can very well see that all children, both dyspraxic here in red and control in blue, were linear. However, dyspraxic children overall were less accurate. So there is more jitter with respect to their position or their estimate compared to the correct estimate. However, both control and dyspraxic show the same effect of anchoring point. That is to say, here we group the responses in 5 classes of position along the number line, and you can see that the percent absolute error is maximal when the hashtag is in between the extreme and the center, here on the left and on the right, while it was smaller when the numbers are falling around the center and around the extreme, indicating that subjects to perform this task actually use hatch marks, so extreme and center point of reference. The only difference that we could maybe detect in dyspraxic children also in this task is that they tended to underestimate more larger number. Indeed, if you look at the signed error, you can see that both control children and dyspraxic tend to overestimate small number here and tend to underestimate large number. And the underestimation is bigger for large number for dyspraxic. Fortunately, and because we had a clinical suggestion that these children not only have a problem of coordinating the effector hand, but also have a problem of controlling the effector eye, we also measure eye movement in this population. And first of all, we demonstrated indeed that the pattern of fixation on the screen across all trial in dyspraxic, here in yellow, compared to control in blue, is very different. Not only dyspraxic children are more erratic, but they actually look further away from the line more often than control children. However, both dyspraxic and control, again, eye movement data show that use anchoring point. They fixate more often the end point here. So here it's an analysis of region of interest. We measure the eye fixation at around 100, around 0, and around the middle point as a function of the position of the hatch mark. And so, for example, here, when the hatch mark was at the extreme, they were looking very, very often at the anchoring point 100. And the fixation to 100 decreases as a function of the distance of the hatch mark from the 100, and so on and so forth. So you can see the 3 peaks of fixation are the extreme and the center for both control and dyspraxic children. And then we wanted to see the precision of their fixation of the hatch mark. Remember, they are linear, so the representation of number doesn't seem to be impaired. However, their error around the exact number is bigger. So can this be explained by the pattern of eye movement? Do they manage to really fixate the hatch mark? And indeed, what we show is that as the numbers, the hatch mark was falling on the right side of the line, dyspraxic children fixated away from the exact position of the hatch mark. Here, for illustration, I just plot the hatch mark that fall in the 0 to 20 or 80 to 100, but I will show you the performance in all the position. And the crossing of these 2 lines is the position of the hatch mark. You can see that dyspraxic children in red look more time away, especially above the hatch mark, and especially they have a bias toward looking more to the right side of the hatch mark comparing to the control, even though this pattern of fixation more to the right part of the hatch mark is present also in controls. In fact, here we can plot the saccadic error as a function of the position of the hatch mark, and you can see that the error increases as the hatch mark goes to the right of the visual space, which is an interesting effect, which I'm not aware we knew before. And interestingly as well, we can see that this effect can be directly related to the pattern of signed error. Indeed, it seems that dyspraxic children, instead of looking at the hatch mark, they looked more right, on the right of the hatch mark, and this was corresponding to a further underestimation of the number corresponding to the hatch mark position, which can seem a contradictory finding, but could be explained by the fact that the internal numerical system takes into account the error of the visual system, but overcorrects it and therefore underestimates the number that corresponds to the hash mark. Of course, in this experiment, we can't separate whether the numerical ability is influenced by the eye movement or it is the other way around. All we can say is that even though there is not a huge impairment here, there is a strong intertwined relationship between the performance of this very, very basic task and the pattern of eye movement and eye fixation. We also had a task that, by definition, didn't involve, or at least explicitly, eye movement control, which was a calculation task. So numbers appeared on the screen, they stayed on the screen for the entire trial, and we asked subject to perform one-digit simple addition and subtraction. And you can see that dyspraxic children are both in reaction times and in accuracy impaired compared to normal children. When they make errors, and they make more error than their controls, the size of their error is also much bigger. They make more overestimation and more underestimation in addition and subtractions. And so how is this pattern of impairment in calculation, which is much more important than the impairment they have in the number line, related to their impairment in the visuospatial and visual-motor coordination ability? We found a pattern of congruent and consistent correlation between their score of the MABC test, which is the test that is testing motor coordination, and the accuracy in subtraction, and the percent absolute error, the size of their error they make in subtraction. The worse they make calculation, the worse they also were in motor coordination. Not only there was a correlation with the motor coordination, but also with the test of visuospatial ability. So you can see the arrow test is a test in which children don't have to move their hand, but they have to decide whether a flash is pointing to a point or not. And the worse they are, these children, the worse they perform their addition and subtractions. So with this experiment, we can maybe say that learning calculation makes use, and conclude that makes use of cortical resources which are also essential for fine motor coordination and visuospatial processes. However, of course, there are critical issues to take into account. First of all, we have shown recently that numerical abilities, even very simple numerical abilities, such as the ability to compare dot patterns, for example, are correlated with visuospatial and visual motor ability even prior to learning formal calculation. So we tested a group of kindergarteners in different tasks that we thought would tap on the dorsal stream of visual processing. Here, an image in which activation to saccade, calculation, and pointing in a study of Simone et al. Is projecting onto an adult brain, and we made the assumption that maybe in children we could expect the same pattern of cortical proximity or pertinence of the dorsal stream of these tasks, finger gnosis, grasping ability, and we also asked numerical comparison and visuospatial memory, and we compare it to tasks that were of more related to the ventral stream, such as face and object recognition. We could study the pattern of correlation across these tasks in our group of kindergarteners, and what we show is that all the dorsal tasks heavily correlates one with the other in the complete absence of the correlation with this task with ventral tasks. Indeed, with principal component analysis, we show that the inter-individual differences across these tasks could be very well explained, but only two components: a dorsal component grouping all these tasks together, and a ventral component. So if numerical abilities is already intertwined and correlates with visuospatial ability prior to formal education with symbols and arithmetical calculation, we have to understand if there is an additional effect of education on this. And a second, final critical issue that I want to discuss here with you is that, in fact, even though in the normal and even in the abnormally developing population that we have seen, numerical and visuospatial visual motor ability can be associated, in fact, we know from the literature of individual case studies that they can be fully dissociated. So from one side of the coin, here an example of this Madame S that I discussed with you before, deeply dyscalculic subject, but that has perfectly fine visuospatial and praxic ability. As a matter of fact, she's a she's also playing the cello. But on top of playing the cello, I tested her with a bunch of tests for visuospatial and visuomotor ability, and she's perfectly fine with it. Again, let me talk about more this Ludovic case. When I explained you his exceptional calculation ability, I didn't tell you that this boy is profoundly dyspraxic. But not dyspraxic as our group of children, much more. His MABC score, that our children score lower than the 15th percentile, he's lower than the 5th percentile compared to the population controlled for his age and schooling. Block design, he can't do the task. Block construction is really, really, really impaired in visuopraxic and visuospatial tasks. As a matter of fact, he doesn't even understand words that relate to spatial position. For example, words like under, behind, above, beneath. So how do we explain the fact that exceptional calculation ability can be achieved even in the absence or in the deep impairment of visuospatial and visuomotor capacities? So to conclude, we can say that by learning symbols for numbers and symbolic calculation, children significantly expand their pre-existing number sense. And we have also shown that visuospatial and motor abilities might be crucially involved in this learning process, but their critical role still needs to be demonstrated. First of all, we have to find ways to disentangle common maturational trajectory, maybe due to cortical proximity of these different areas that subtend this different function, from intrinsic causal relation between visuospatial and calculation ability. And finally, also, I think it is interesting to study children with unusual learning pathway, because by studying those children, we may unveil the very core mechanism underlying numeracy acquisition. And this may further help, for example, in imaging alternative pedagogical tools for children with developmental learning disabilities. Thank you for your attention.